The following featured presentation is part of the Skywalking Network.
Welcome to Star Warsologies, the podcast about science and other academic fields of study seen in Star Wars. I'm one of your hosts, Melissa Miller. I'm the science and technology writer at Nerdist and also do some freelance writing for Star Wars Insider.
And I'm your other host, James Floyd. I am a freelancer for Star Wars Insider magazine and StarWars.com. This episode, Star Warsologies, is going to chat about holograms as represented in Star Wars from A New Hope's "Help Me, Obi-Wan Kenobi, You're My Only Hope" all the way through today's shows. Our guest expert today is Thomas Connor, who is a PhD researcher and lecturer in communication and science studies, focusing on holograms, real virtuality, and performance. Hi, Thomas.
Hi, thanks so much for inviting me. I am thrilled to be here and to speak with some like minds about holograms in the very sci-fi franchise that basically recreated them.
Yes, great. We're excited to have you. And I thought James misspoke there, but real virtuality. Tell us what that is, and is it different from virtual reality?
Well, real virtuality is just a term that I came up with. You're an academic, you got to coin some words, right? So most of the digital visual technologies that I focus on are more augmented reality types of technologies, as opposed to virtual reality when you put on the goggles and your awareness basically goes into the machine, as it were. Augmented realities are the things that overlay digital imagery and objects and information onto the real world through, Google Glass type devices or other sorts of things. And a lot of the, digital holograms that we've seen in the last, 10, 15 years, performative things are often what I focus on, like the Tupac thing. Similar types of things. You're taking digital stuff out of the box and trying to put it into reality in some way. So sort of reversing the virtual reality thing and calling it real virtuality. That also stems from, some of the study that I do on actual optical holograms and holography, where there is kind of a difference between an optical hologram image, between what they call a real hologram and a virtual hologram. And a virtual hologram, again, is one that appears to be behind the plate, behind the frame, and a real one is one that seems to be coming out. And I'm way more interested in the stuff that is coming out. I've come out so many times already. I'm interested in those things too.
So what are holograms? You talk about two different kinds, but let's just take us through the basics.
Well, there's the rub, right? It's the change in the definition of this word that has driven most of my historical curiosity in this. So the word hologram, really has two fairly distinct definitions now. The second of which was, really entirely kicked off by Star Wars. So the first definition, the first hologram idea, the word was really coined in, 1948 by a physicist named Dennis Gabor.
Not like Mr. Hollow or anything like that?
No, not like Hollow Man, right? He actually recoined the word. There was a word that existed for centuries called holograph, which had to do with text. It meant any document that was wholly written by someone's own hand. So it meant to imply, wholeness and completeness. And he was bringing that idea to this image. And his project, he was trying to increase the resolution of electron microscopes. And he theorized a way to do this through this diffractive light pattern, but it needed a really bright light that was not yet available in 1948. And so it was theoretical until lasers came along in the next 10 or 15 years. His definition, His definition was, he called it the art of freezing a light wave into a photographic plate. And so to make a hologram, you essentially situate an object you put it on a table with a bunch of lasers and mirrors in this certain arrangement. You've got one light shining on the plate, the film basically, and another on the object itself. And the diffraction pattern between those two sources gets captured and, like he says, frozen into the plate. And then that image gets revived by another laser or another light so that the 3D image of the object is reproduced. So a hologram is like a replay of the light shining off the object at the time you tried to image it.
So That's kind of like just a photograph. It's a still, and it's basically like the things that you see in 2D that are all rainbow colored, whether it's something simple like on your credit card to some of those classic National Geographic magazine covers, like with the skull from the 80s. So that's
Exactly.
what we're talking about for this is the original hologram.
Yes, these are, and I'll refer to them, I'll distinguish them in speech usually by calling them optical holograms because it's a totally optical technique and not a digital technique. And that existed in science. Gabor's hopes for it didn't really pan out. It eventually became sort of an aesthetic thing, and I write a lot about the Museum of Holography that existed in New York in the 70s and 80s, where artists tried to do something unique and innovative with it. But really, it sort of became more useful and more popular as a kitschy thing in exactly the examples that you cited there. You know, we all carry one around on our in our pockets on our credit cards. So the second definition, you know, at the same time, holograms were sort of going through that transition, optical holograms becoming these aesthetic objects. George Lucas starts writing and drafting Star Wars and creates this new imaginary communication tech based on the actual optical holograms that he had seen exhibited around the Bay Area. And the definitions in the drafts of the script sound like actual holograms. They originally described the Leia image with this kind of shimmering rainbow effect, like an optical hologram. And he refers to his imagery as a hologram, you know, only in the script directions, mind you. But it's not an optical hologram that's like seen on a plate and revived by a light source. As we all know, Leia, the first hologram we see, Princess Leia's, you know, cumbersomely delivered video mail message, is this projected, freestanding, digitally produced image. So you get these three wholly new attributes applied to the same kind of word. And I think the tech is seen, just twice in the first film. I think later in the film, there's like the Death Star battle plans has a little hologram thing to show.
Except
Right.
that I think is more a 2D computer graphics because you see it on a screen there as opposed to projected out. But there is the hollow chessboard, the Dejarik things aboard the Falcon,
right.
and you know that's supposed to be holographic. I don't know, it still looks good today. It's so beautiful.
Yeah, I was trying to think of that, the screens, because I feel like someone gets force choked, you know, via Zoom at some point, but I think you're right that that's a screen, not the actual like hologram.
Don't do it to me now. So
Yeah.
it became a sensation after that, even though, you know, you've got the culture who starts immediately using the word hologram to describe this newfangled imaginary imagery, even though no one in the film actually says the word.
Yeah.
It's not until I think episode 3, many years later, that somebody in a script actually utters the word hologram.
Star Trek Next Generation used the holodeck, and presumably other sci-fi-ish stories also started having holograms.
Oh yeah, it's been ubiquitous ever since, right? I mean, we can't get away from them, from the Minority Report things and the flying around in front of his hands to the way Star Trek developed them in a completely different way. We can talk about some of the differences there, about how Star Wars uses holograms as primarily only a representative communication device. And in Star Trek, you get the use of, first of all, they become more solid because you have actual actors depicting them, and they in turn become presented as these liberal individual subjects. You know, it's less representative than it is ontological. You've got, you know, the Doctor is a person. The Doctor is not an image, even though you could argue either way.
I mean, we even have in performance, we have Gwen Stefani's making a holoback girl.
I haven't heard about that one.
I think that's probably just a dad joke, is my guess, James.
Okay.
That was good though, because you could imagine it, right? Like that actually sounds like something that now she's gonna hear this and get that idea.
Oh,
right,
exactly.
Gwen, call me,
I mean,
call me Gwen.
I mean, I've seen holograms by people as diverse as Ronnie James Dio. I came up to LA to see the Ronnie James Dio hologram, and it's like, who thought he was an interesting subject for a hologram? But it was, you know, kind of an interesting show.
Wow, I had no idea. So I'm curious, what did you study that you ended up getting, you know, this sort of focus? And did seeing Star Wars influence you to learn more about holograms?
Sure. Well, I came to this kind of backwards. I became interested in a lot of the current spectacles, namely a lot of the music performative stuff that I mentioned. And then then I got interested in the history of it. Once I found out that the system that is used to produce something like a Tupac hologram or any of these others is based exactly on this Pepper's Ghost stage illusion that was created in the 19th century. A lot of new media scholarship is a bunch of reminders that new media is never new. It's all based on a lot of old stuff with a lot of venerable history. My personal interest in this started with a press release that I got. I was a music critic for a long time. I was a journalist for 20 plus years before academia, and most of that time was a pop music critic. I was at the Chicago Sun-Times as the music columnist, and I got a press release one day that said, and I still remember the headline, it said, "Meet the world's first virtual pop diva." And it went on to describe this amazing technological spectacle about this young girl from Japan who was actually a hologram, and she was going to perform in concert. And it sounded just bizarre enough that I thought, well, I'll go check it out and get a blog post out of it or something. I've got dinner that night, but I'll stop by, I'll see it. So I stopped by, and the place is jam-packed. And so my journalism spidey sense kind of goes up, and I'm like, something's going on here that I don't know about. I need to pay attention. Massive crowd in the theater. It's one of these like Fathom events kind of things where the concert's in Japan, but it's being simulcast across America. Tons of people there. The show starts. Everybody's into it. Everybody there except me knows what's going on, is excited, starts singing along. And character at heart here is called Hatsune Miku. She is what is called a Japanese Vocaloid performer. This is basically a digital character that has been created to sing songs that are written for her using a particular software. And it, through a long story short, it became this huge popular thing in Japan. And they use this kind of Pepper's Ghost technology to then put her on stage. So you've got a theater full of live people. You've got a stage full of live musicians playing music. And the only thing that is then different about the concert experience is that in place of the human singer in the center of the action, you now have a projected anime figure that is doing all the singing, allegedly.
That's projected on a screen in front, or like a glass, or what is it projected onto?
It's projected onto a transparent screen that is on the stage. There are a couple of different ways you can set up a Pepper's Ghost. The way that I'm describing in the Hatsune Miku, for instance, you've got a transparent screen on the stage that is, I mean, A, it's transparent, and B, they make sure that, you know, you don't see the edges because you're not supposed to see the screen. You're supposed to engage with the image as if it's not an image, as if it's an entity there in your social space and social relations. And the projection, in this case, the projection is coming from behind. It's a different kind of technology. Other technologies, the projection is in front onto a reflective surface that is also hidden, and then that light reflects onto the same sort of transparent screen on the stage. But either way, you've got a digital animation that is being projected, and the light is captured onto this transparent screen so that it looks like there's this person standing there among all these other people. And because these are usually presented on stages among other musicians, or in the case of like Tupac, you had Dr. Dre and Snoop Dogg standing right next to him, and they sort of had this choreographed interaction with each other. That sort of adds to the, oh, this is a real thing that deserves to be there and take him seriously as an entity. And so I'm, you know, that night I'm sitting here watching this thing, and my jaw hits the floor, and it's this wild spectacle. And I think, well, all right, I'm texting my friends. I'm not going to make dinner. I start taking notes. You know, I'm like, this is what I'm going to write my master's thesis about. And that's, you know, that's where it's gone since. I've been writing about this stuff ever since.
Wow. So it sounds to me like we're way ahead, really, of Star Wars in this particular technology then.
Yeah, well, you can look at it technically both ways, that we're way ahead culturally in presenting these things in ways that are more interesting and maybe more fun than you see depicted in Star Wars. Or you can look at it the other way and go, well, these are still screens. There is still a material screen involved. We're not projecting Princess Leia or anybody else into midair, which is still and probably will remain some kind of impossibility. You know, there have always been criticisms about digital holograms from the optical holography community.
I'm sure they were very, very happy about getting their term co-opted completely.
Yes.
It's like, this George Lucas guy ruined us.
Yes, I did an internship several years ago at an actual a holography studio just so I could learn more about it and understand it better. And yeah, you get in conversations with these people, they get very persnickety about it. Even in my work, there's lots of air quotes and scare quotes. I have to talk about holograms, and then I have to talk about quote unquote holograms in that way. There was a famous holographer I think it was in the early 80s. He was at a conference. His name's Stephen Benton. And he said something at a conference to the effect of, this image of R2-D2 that has captivated millions of people, and these people ought to know better. He said, photons do not yet turn around in midair as they would have to for such a result.
I mean, tell it to the lightsabers,
Wow,
Right,
I'm just
right.
thinking about, at the level that photons turning around in midair and basically spreading everywhere so that anyone on any side of it gets the light. That's really mind-boggling. That's crazy.
It's a huge challenge to think about when you really get technical about it. Because you would have to scatter a coherent image omnidirectionally so that Luke, C-3PO, R2-D2, and Obi-Wan can see the same thing from where they are. Well, it's not the same.
Yeah.
You're
eyes
seeing the
follow
different sides
you?
of
Wow, Melissa just found a way to make holograms really creepy.
Well, and that's one thing that I write about a lot too, is that this should be an uncanny, creepy phenomenon that is essentially not. It's not presented that way in the film, and we often experience them and talk about them in real life as if it's just this, natural futuristic thing going on. It's this totally mundane thing in Star Wars, right? Everybody has seen these, but essentially, it's creepy. It's a ghost. The spectrality of this imagery should freak us the frack out, right? But we're so used to the disembodied voices of radio and the phantoms of cinema and television that, this is just another ghost for us in modern life.
Well, it's like, when you put on the 3D glasses and you see the thing there, your brain registers that object in front of you and you start reaching for it. And so this is something without the glasses that, you're should be reaching for because it's not really there. You can see through it, but it's there. One of the other ways that I've seen maybe holograms kind of done or could be done is having a whole bunch of like little tiny LEDs or something spinning around really fast that turn on and off. So it creates a 3D light object. Is that a different style? Are those holograms or is that something else?
Well, the way I broadly use the term hologram, yes, it all falls under that umbrella, right? There are numerous different kinds of prototypes in play right now in trying to create this kind of imagery. One of the things, this may be what you're describing or related to it. There are hologram fans.
That's basically
so it's essentially a fan that's placed just like a fan would be, but it has a bunch of LED lights on it that are programmed in such a way so that once the fan is spinning, I don't know the details about how that kind of thing works, but it produces an image that seems to move and seems to be 3D in such a way.
And if you did that in a way that was 3D, you could then have, instead of just having a flat fan, you have it as kind of a two-dimensional fan blades coming up. And then when that spins, you could get 3D looking things.
And I've seen
if that doesn't exist, I just invented it.
Yes.
You're on a roll.
Rush right out and get the patent now.
Wow.
I've seen the fans in situations where they're placed, they have to be placed kind of up high because there is that instinctive urge when you see a spectral hologram 3D image that you want to reach out and touch it. And, if you reach out and touch the spinning fan, that would end badly. But there are some other things. There's another colleague of mine and I who are writing a paper right now about haptic holograms and different ways that there are some technologies trying to create a sense of touch, of something for you to actually touch. And they're using sound waves and using jets of air and all these different sort of experimental methods so that, if you create some digital image of Princess Leia, you might be able to reach out and actually touch her hand or something like that.
And she would be like, no, don't touch me.
Yes. No, in this environment, maybe that was a bad example. We'll start with just simple, cups and saucers.
Well, yeah. And it's interesting to think about Star Wars, the communication, Princess Leia, obviously. And then I know I think it's episode 1, there's like a walking thing that's.
Yeah. Sidious
like
is on
talking,
a holographic walking thing and the Neimoidians are talking to him.
Right. So the communication thing, but when you were talking about the concert that you went to, it's, not out of the realm of possibility that it's being used in different ways, right? Like the Holo News, isn't the news called Holo News?
Yeah, the Holo
The
News
HoloNet. Yeah.
Right, the HoloNet, yeah, and concerts and stuff like that. Just because we don't go and see all of these fun things doesn't mean that there's not, clubs and stuff like that where these things are being used. So
I was trying to think before we did this about if there is any like really entertainment or cultural hologram representation. In the special edition of Jedi, did they add some hologram to the Jabba music palace thing? I can't remember.
I
No.
think that was all live.
Okay.
Yeah,
All right.
we do see in the Clone Wars and some of the animated series, they do a little bit more with holograms. You kind of get basically a radio station that some clones are listening to, and it has kind of a holographic DJ type thing.
Right.
And we see it mostly for point-to-point communication or recordings or presentations. Admiral Akbar's Death Star on Endor thing.
Right. That's the hologram battle plan I'm thinking of.
Yeah, that's the one. And then media and broadcasting that they still have 2D broadcasting, but then also you go walk through a city and there's basically like pop-up ads.
That's what I was thinking too.
Yeah.
Something on Coruscant, like advertisements.
Yeah.
Right. Sort of a crossover like with what they do in Blade Runner and that sort of thing.
Yeah, but
Yeah.
one of the things they created in Clone Wars cartoon is something basically just a holographic disguise matrix that you wear it and it changes your appearance. It's an appearance changing thing, and it combines with some sort of little vocalize changer. So you talk with the voice that matches the face you've created. And how would that be different? Because that you're kind of projecting over a body that's a 3D object as opposed to projecting into a space.
Right, and that makes me think, isn't there something like that in Total Recall? Isn't there a moment where some guy basically like transforms his face in some digital way to get by a security clerk or something like that, and then it goes wrong and he
Well, I know that Black Widow does it in one of the MCU movies where she like pulls off a like
Oh right, yeah,
sheet basically from her face, and she's
the Black Widow movie has that tech.
Mm-hmm.
And the best musical hologram, of course, is Jem.
Yes.
Oh yeah.
Jem and the Holograms.
Thinking about
who use holograms. That's their whole use of holograms is for disguise, so that they can get into hijinks before the show, and then they have the holographic outfits for the show and all that kind of stuff.
But I'm wondering if that's, I don't know. To me, it seems almost the way you've described it, that maybe mapping onto the face is almost easier than what we're talking about, the communication holograms, because it's sort of like what they're doing anyway when they de-age people, right? Is you have one face and then map something onto that instead of trying to project it not onto a screen.
Right. And the sort of lo-fi versions that we get to play with now in smartphone applications and things like that, where you can add features to your face or emojis or things like that.
Snapchat filters.
Right.
Yeah.
So just real life Snapchat filters. I feel like that's got to only be a couple years around the corner from us already, right?
And that goes back to that uncanny valley. Things that would just creep you out.
Yes, exactly. Well, and you talk about things that are happening now. One of the scenes that you get often in Star Wars is in the Jedi Council chamber, where you have various knights who are around the realm who can't make it to the chamber, so they zoom into the meeting in hologram form.
Oh, and they're sitting there right in their chair as if they were sitting, as if they were really there. So it's like the projector puts them in their chair, and hopefully they're sitting on a similar enough surface where they are. Right. Or the computers are so good that even if they're standing somewhere, it just maps them onto a seated body. I mean, you can do a lot.
You're more inventive than I am. I've always thought that this was great for furniture makers in the long time ago far away, because this means you have to have one chair in the chambers and the exact same chair wherever they are.
Well, that would be the easiest way to do it.
But you have a lot of technology today, especially after the pandemic, that's being sold as and marketed as this sort of option, a solution to Zoom fatigue or a 3D hologram Zoom option. I'm in conversation with a lot of people at Proto Hologram, which is this company in LA that makes these hologram machines that are, they look like a phone booth, basically. And on the production end, you've got somebody who stands in front of your basic sort of stage setup with a blank background and cameras, capturing the image that is then sent into this box, and it's made to look like a 3D sort of image, and that's being sold in similar ways, that you can zoom into the Jedi Council meeting or your basic board meeting,
but you're in color.
But you're in color, yeah, and you're not transparent, and it looks remarkably real. Yeah, it's pretty impressive.
Yeah, when we were talking about it being sort of actually creepy, I was thinking about that. Like, I think I would actually rather be in a room where little paddle screens were like following me, which I feel like happens in maybe the Kingsman or some other movie.
Demolition Man has like the little screens that are following you with the faces.
That's exactly what I'm thinking of. I love that movie. So yeah, you're in a movie and all these little paddles with screens are following you, versus being in the Jedi Council chamber would actually be kind of creepy because of that chair question now. It's like, are you sitting where you are? Did they take a hologram of your body and they're just mapping your face onto it currently? Because that would be weird. Are the chairs holograms? I'm gonna have to go back and watch this scene.
Yeah,
now.
Well, see, Kiadi Mooney phones it in, but he's actually naked back at his end, and they just map it onto his
exactly
Jedi robes.
Right. All those zoom gaps could have been fixed in that way.
Yeah, no, I mean, has the pandemic and video conferencing and Zoom and all of that sort of stuff really accelerated the fields here, the study, or just sort of shown a light on what you have been up to anyway?
I think it's accelerated the marketing language in that way more than anything. I remember early in the pandemic, though, I read some things out of China about somebody was trying to invest in holographic elevator buttons and ATM panels, so that there was something projected away from a surface, so that you didn't have to touch the surface especially early in the pandemic, when we were especially concerned about touching things.
That's interesting.
And it's affected just the way I talk about things, because part of what I find interesting about both the real and the imaginary technologies like this is the ways that it represents this desire for us to create something more satisfying and present with these technologies. And through the pandemic, especially using this very technology, and I'm pointing at the Zoom screen, we know that this has done some great things. And we're emerging from the pandemic, I think, more aware of how it's better than we thought it was going to be in March 2020, right? When we all hated it. There are some really good uses of this now. This is one of them. But it's still fairly unsatisfying when you are in different contexts, when you really want to be with your mother, when you really want to be with a loved one and have a greater sense of presence. And we want more of that from our technologies, and holograms in this way are just really representative of that.
Yeah, no, I'm intrigued now by the haptic holograms that you were talking about. So interested to see what comes of those.
Yeah, that definitely takes us more towards the Star Trek idea of holograms being basically real physical objects and people, but simply made out of light, and even with holographic bullets that can kill if the safety protocols are turned off.
Right, because what makes us a hologram in Star Trek instantly more real and socially valuable and respectful and all that is the solidity, is when it gains solidity of some way, and mobility as well. The Doctor in Voyager, at first he's trapped in the sickbay. That's his holodeck.
That's right.
But eventually they give him the mobile emitter so that he can run around. Now, that's partially a narrative, interesting thing that they do, but it's also a production thing, just as it is in Star Wars. In Star Wars, you have people needing to communicate, and film of someone talking on the phone is really boring. So if you can make that conversation visual in both ways, then you have a much better, more interesting visual narrative. Same sort of thing in Star Trek. I'm sure after a season or two, Robert Picardo was like, you know what, can I do something on another set? Can I get out of here in some ways? And I'm sure the writers wanted that as well. And so they came up with, as they always do in these inventive shows, some way to jailbreak him out of that, limiting system. And then, in Star Trek, I think the Doctor's narrative is super interesting, because over the next several seasons, they do a lot of really interesting, some really hokey, but some really interesting narratives about what it means to become human in that particular way, in becoming solid and becoming, respected and integrated with the rest of the crew. Sure.
Him becoming human fits along the pattern that we see in Star Trek series all along of Spock becoming human, Data trying to be human, Odo trying to be a solid, and now we have a completely photonic being, and then we come across other photonic beings as well, and then the whole issue of holographic rights for these essentially living beings. We don't really see that in Star Wars at all, that we don't really see kind of AI type things. We just simply see it as a tool and not so much combined with other things. So we've kind of seen different places where it could be used in different ways. But it seems like in Star Wars, we're kind of still limited to the language that we saw originally in A New Hope and Return of the Jedi and Empire, of holograms being kind of grainy and see-through, not having, great resolution. Do you think that eventually, if it was real in that universe, that they would have solved those things and made real looking holograms?
Yeah, because I can't think of an instance of a hologram in Star Wars that you would refer to using the phrase that you just used, a photonic being, right? A photonic image, maybe, but not necessarily a being of itself. The only thing that comes to mind that might lean into crossing that line is the hologram of Snoke that you get.
Oh yeah, I forgot about that
in one of the later films. Because in Star Wars, in most of the Star Wars narratives, you get holograms that are, again, they're communication devices, so they're usually small, they're usually handheld things, or they're on the dashboard of the ship or whatever, or they're maximum life-size characters, like in the chamber. I can't think of another example of a hologram that is larger than life-size until you get to Snoke.
Right.
And while the Snoke hologram is still representative, he's still beaming in. It's a Zoom call. It's telepresent, but it's larger than life. It's huge, right?
Yeah.
But it's for a different purpose.
Right.
It's still that kind of communication, but it's in a different ritual context. You've got more of the spiritual power and political power overtones, and he needs to appear in this larger than life form in order to sort of remind you on the other end that you are kneeling and you are subservient and that sort of thing.
I am Oz, the great and powerful.
Exactly. Pay no attention to that man behind the digital whatever.
Well, and I remember telling my husband walking out of The Force Awakens that I really hope, I had lots of questions about Snoke, and what I really wanted to be true when I saw The Last Jedi was that he was he's like Babu Frick size, right? like I was like, okay, I really want Snoke to be like 3 feet tall, maybe,
and have like a voice
modulator and projecting himself up into this huge throne.
Hi,
I wanted
guys.
that so bad. And Brian Johnson had plenty of ideas that I didn't have, but apparently that wasn't one of them.
Well, going back to Empire, we do see that when Vader makes his call to Palpatine is just a kind of a big head taking up the same space as like Vader's whole body.
Right. You don't see too many holographic busts like that. That's interesting.
Yeah, that makes me think more of Wakanda, right? Like in Black Panther, they have those handhelds, and those are mostly busts that I can think of.
But those are supposed to be like solid vibranium moving up and down, but still it has the same effect. It's making a touchable but virtual thing, I guess.
Yeah.
I guess it's real reality, but like an animated form.
Right. Melissa, you brought up something that I think is really interesting, and it touches on something I've been working on recently. There was a Fox reality series last fall called Alter Ego. Are you familiar with this at all?
Yeah, it was interesting.
I'm surprised. It was canceled. Nobody watched it. Some people thought it was creepy, etc. But it's your traditional singing competition show. It's sort of on the model of The Masked Singer, only instead of actual masks, this time your singers are backstage performing in the mocap outfits and all that.
Cool.
And they are presenting on stage as holograms. And their avatar, they have some say in the design of their avatars, and so people get a little crazy, and there's lots of blue skin, and some people have flaming hair and tentacles and all this kind of stuff.
Amazing.
I thought of it when you were talking about Snoke and you're thinking that he was totally different than what he was projecting, because there's a lot of discourse in that show about how these holograms can be used for exactly that purpose. in order to stoke up the emotional drama of the reality show, they present a lot of narratives about the singer's origins and where they came from and all. And many of them talk about how they want to do this and they want to present as this hologram because of various things. They have certain physical conditions that make them nervous about performing in usual contexts. They are otherwise very shy, etc. And so there's this discourse about it's problematic in some ways too, but it's interesting that there's this idea being presented that the hologram can be this mask that you can present into the world in ways that make you feel more genuine and more comfortable.
Yeah. It's kind of liberating.
Yeah. No, that's an interesting first date question, I guess, if that show, took off, or if anyone watched it, would be, what would your avatar look like? I feel like that's some really interesting insights. I'll have to go look for at least a trailer for this show because I totally missed that happening. Well, you did a Comic-Con panel, which is how we learned about you. What else did you talk about on that panel in terms of pop culture properties? Were there other people on the panel with you?
Yeah, there were three people who were supposed to be on the panel. One of them couldn't make it, Tara Knight, who is a brilliant professor at the University of Colorado Boulder. And the other fellow, Rafi Krishek, from the Proto Hologram company that I mentioned. So yeah, I was talking about a lot of the history that leads up to now, and then he sort of talked about his example of what they're trying to do now to make something like this.
The other thing I was thinking about was the holo chess. James mentioned it briefly at the beginning. I don't actually remember what it's called.
Dejarik.
There we go.
Dejarik? I always pronounce it Dejarik.
That sounds more Star Wars-y somehow than the other one.
Yeah, there's got to be a K in there somewhere.
But I think it was in the most recent, in Light and Magic. I don't know if you've watched the show about sort of behind the scenes at ILM. They were talking about that is a stop motion sequence. I don't remember now what the order of it was, whether or not it just wasn't looking right. So they decided to make it a hologram. So it would, take away some pixels and allow for it not to look quite right. Or that was always the intention. But I just think that that's sort of an interesting, like the bad resolution of the holograms that we see for the most part could just be that way we don't have to make them very good in 1977, sort of trick.
Well, and it's also a way of indexing for the audience that this is a communication technology. The first time we see the Princess Leia hologram, we see the beam coming from the lens on R2-D2's dome, and the lens looks exactly as the audience in 1977 would have recognized a projection lens, right? And you get the really defined beam from that lens to the Princess Leia image. You don't see the beam that often,
right?
Or at least that clearly in the future. But again, then it was like communicating to people, this is a technical communication thing. And I've read a lot about the scan lines and all that kind of thing too, that sort of thing was added in order to go, look, audience, this is like a video technology that you've seen, only it's placed in a different way and in a different context, so you can make that leap into whatever futuristic thing this is supposed to be.
They did it that way so that the audience could get it. Because if you didn't have those lines, you might not draw the connection between R2-D2 and the recording.
Right. He's the source of the recording. And then in some other things I've written about, in that second scene where R2-D2 shows the complete message for Obi-Wan, when Obi-Wan is present, you get a lot of shots around the room showing everybody present viewing the image and to show the 3D-ness of the image. But the very last shot in that scene doesn't include R2-D2. R2-D2 is cut out of the frame, so that you only see 3PO, Luke, and Obi-Wan looking at the image. And I've written about this as a way to say that's this sort of final way to remove the technology from the visual experience, just like Pepper's Ghost tries to veil the fact that there is a mediating technology there, etc. Because again, the idea is for you to engage with the image as a social entity rather than it being an obvious technical thing that's on a screen or whatever we're used to.
Yeah. Well, and that one's like you said, a straight recording, right? She was standing right in front of R2, was like, hey, I have a message, record it, and then played it back versus, the other ones we see, the Emperor and Darth Vader are millions of light years apart or something like that. So it kind of makes sense maybe that they'd be a little bit choppier or whatever.
Yeah, that certainly you want to have some file compression there to save bandwidth.
Yeah. And why was that the obvious choice for her in that moment? The ship's being invaded. She's in a hurry. quick, let's make a holographic message really quickly. I mean, couldn't you just say, R2, tell Obi-Wan? I don't know. You got to have that visual for the film.
Yeah.
Yeah, well, and he's a sass. I feel like he could be like, wait, the lighting's really good. Let me just get this on video real quick. You look great.
Wait, R2-D2 is saying that?
Yes.
Yeah. Well, now I imagine that Leia would be like, yeah, I don't trust R2-D2 to deliver this message the way I want. I better record it.
Right.
He's going to alter it a little bit.
And with that one lens on his head, he gets a 3D image all the way around her. I find that fascinating.
Right. Yeah, true. As much as I love Rogue One, it was something that I kind of wish they had used more in Rogue One versus the de-aging or whatever technology that they used, right? There was no reason to show us Moff Tarkin so many times not reflected in a window pane or via hologram, communication. And I feel like it could have helped with that uncanniness that I definitely get when I watch those scenes of Rogue One.
It's an impressive digital actor job right there, though.
Yeah.
And I always found it funny. I remember reading that the reason you only see him from the waist up is because Peter Cushing insisted on wearing slippers during the filming.
Yeah.
I hope that's true.
No, it is. Yeah, he found those boots to be really tough. And he's like, hey, you know what? I'm Peter Cushing. I'm going to wear little fuzzy slippers and you guys will deal with it.
I must find a behind the scenes picture of this. I hope they have bunny rabbit ears and everything.
I know.
I'm wondering if there's some 501st member out there that does a Tarkin with slippers as their canon costume.
Yes. Awesome. If so, virtual high five. That would be amazing.
Picture, please.
Well, if someone is interested in getting into holography, what would you recommend they do? Sounds like you had a bit of a circuitous route.
Yeah, no, I'm a typical journalist who jumped ship in order to get out of a troubled industry. But I had been teaching for 20 years before that anyway, so I just naturally fell into doing this. So yeah, it's if I were going to suggest someone, getting into teaching, the way to start is, unfortunately, these days as an adjunct. I say unfortunately only because the pay is so low and the work is so much usually. But that's the way to get like any profession starting from the ground up. That's kind of the way to get your foot in the door.
Well, last question, most important. We are judging you. Who is your favorite Star Wars character?
Oh, my favorite Star Wars character. I mean, Boba Fett comes immediately to mind just because I was, a teenage boy who had like 18 versions of that action figure. And I always thought he was cool because of all the gadgetry and everything.
Solid choice. How did you feel about the new shows involving Boba Fett?
Well, I was holding back from going on about that because I've been a little disappointed in the book of Boba Fett. But I love The Mandalorian.
Everyone I know who was super into Boba Fett was disappointed in Book of Boba Fett. And those of us who didn't care that much about the character were like, yeah, sure, this is fine. So yeah, I can see that. It makes sense because you had, if you were a teenager, you had your own ideas about where he'd been and where he was going. And so if they don't do it the same that you had been thinking about.
Yeah, no, I love the backstories. I'm not that well read in all the novels and all that in the Star Wars universe, except some of my favorite books there was a series of short story collections from many years ago. Tales of the Bounty Hunters, Tales of Jabba's Palace, that sort of thing. I love it whenever somebody justifies the work that some of these guys did on some of these people did on making this creature who sat in a corner, and somebody then takes that up and writes this whole life story for them. I love that kind of stuff. And there was a really great one about Boba Fett in one of those. And I think the whole thing takes place inside the Sarlacc's stomach. It's great.
Oh, right. Yeah. I remember that one. Those books were my favorite.
Yeah. Tales of Jabba's Palace. I can draw a direct line to what we are doing right here. And, whatever 10-year-old me reading Tales of Jabba's Palace.
Yeah. So much
absolutely. Fun. Okay.
Well, thank you so much for coming out and joining us, Thomas. We certainly learned a lot about holograms and how we as a society kind of interact with them and how Star Wars changed the entire concept of holograms.
I feel like now you two, all of our listeners can, the next time they hear someone use hologram, be like, well, actually, that is an optical hologram.
Quote unquote hologram. Right. Thank you so much for having me. It's been great to chat virtually about virtuality in Star Wars.
Yeah, we didn't ask you where to find you. So where can we find you on social media or any of your upcoming publications that you mentioned?
You bet. You can find more about me and my research and contact me through my website, which is just my name, Thomas Conner. That's Holograms.info.
Great. Well, thanks so much for being here.
Thank you so much.
That wraps up this episode of Star Warsologies. We want to thank our guest, Thomas Connor, and we want to thank all of you for listening. And I really want to thank all of our fans that came to see me at Silicon Valley Comic-Con. You can find my panel, ILM Creatives Celebrate 20 Years of Episode 2, on our YouTube channel. I put up all the slides. We had some great ILM people come out and share with me behind-the-scenes photos from the early 2000s, and it was a really great panel, and there were a couple people who came and spoke to me specifically, and I really appreciate that support and for having a full room at Silicon Valley Comic-Con.
Who did you have on that panel?
I had Don Bees, John Goodson, Kim Smith, Nelson Hall, and Fawn Davis, and then Adam Savage was there to introduce us, but he didn't stick around for the panel because he had a million places to be that weekend.
Awesome. Well, if you have an idea for a topic for Star Warsologies or know an expert we should interview, let us know at starwarsologies@gmail.com or Star Warsologies on Twitter and Instagram. That is StarWarsologies. Also, come join our Facebook fans group if you want to talk with us and your fellow listeners. It's called Star Warsologies Podcast Fan Group. Just search for it on Facebook.
Yes, I am always ready to talk Star Wars, so bring your best questions. And please, please, please do us a favor and rate, review, and subscribe to this podcast on your favorite service.
No topic is off limits, even whether Arabesh is really an alphabet or just a font.
We are part of the Skywalking Network, where you can also find a variety of other great shows about Star Wars, Disney, and Marvel, including classic Marvel Star Wars comics, the Max FX podcast, Resilience Squadron, and the flagship show Skywalking Through Neverland. There's also a YouTube show, Today in Star Wars History. You can find all of that at skywalkingnetwork.com.
See you next time on Star Warsologies when we discuss family, adoption, and Star Wars.